Welcome to Walls of Sound. Your hosts, Brian Teasley and Ryan Murphy, have spent decades on both sides of the stage, from playing in bands and running venues to uncovering the stories and history behind those spaces. This is the podcast where music meets the places that shape it. And here, they'll explore the people, history, and culture of music venues, how they're built, how they're run, and how they've created the soundtracks of our lives. From legendary halls to underground hideaways, these walls hold the stories that make music come alive. So step inside, because every wall has a story to tell.
Case study, the Honky Tonk. In this two-part episode, we dig into the real history of the honky tonk, starting with where it actually came from and why it existed in the first place. In part one, we move past the cartoon version of honky tonks and look at them as working-class spaces built for letting off steam and washing away your woes. These were places people went after long days of physical labor, to drink, to dance, to fight, to cry, and to just make it through the day. We trace how honky tonks grew out of earlier southern spaces like saloons, barrelhouses, juke joints, and dance halls, and how the rooms themselves shaped the music. These were chaotic, crowded spaces where bands had to fight just to get attention. From Texas to Oklahoma to Bakersfield to Nashville and beyond, we follow the rise of the honky tonk through the 1940s and 50s. The songs of Hank Williams, Lefty Frizzell, Kitty Wells, and Webb Pierce, and into the reset that comes later with outlaw country. Part one sets the groundwork for the story, how these places formed, why people needed them, and how they shaped a sound that still echoes today. I'm Brian Teasley, along with...
I'm Ryan Murphy.
And misconstrued, misunderstood subject we'll be talking about today, and that is, file this under the category of venue archetypes, which is the honky tonk. A very important one. Ryan, I think out of all the different types of music venues over history, this is one of the most misunderstood.
Yeah, agreed. To the point where it's hard to even say the word without it being this cartoony or derogatory. Place is just a honky tonk.
Which is kind of how it started. And I mean, there are upsides and downsides with how corporatized it's gotten, because obviously when we zoom into the industry of Lower Broadway in Nashville now, That's creates a lot of income for that city. But at the same time, they kind of started off as these very small type of places where working class people could just go and work things out or not, or cause new problems.
Yeah, and I think to that, it's interesting. Being from Florida, when I think about things being kind of more commercialized and stuff, I think of like Disneyfication of things, right? That's like in the lexicon. When you think of music venues, it's funny, you think of like a House of Blues, right? That's like a chain kind of curated, and there's a lot of good like House of Blues formats, and I've seen some great shows at House of Blues, and not bagging on House of Blues as much as, you know, originally when I was thinking about what's a honky tonk, I think of the version that a honky tonk that would be downtown Disney. You have to dress the part to walk in the door. You got, you know, there's a corniness to it all. I remember, this is probably going back a decade or so now, I hadn't really been to Nashville much. You know, I've been there a lot since. Even being on tour, like, you know, years and years ago, Nashville wasn't really a spot. You know, especially for like the bands we were in, there wasn't really a place to play. Like Nashville was kind of hit or miss. It was kind of city you could skip. But, you know, about a decade or so ago, Lauren and I decided we wanted to do this little trip to Nashville. And I was excited to see like the music history side of things. And then we went to Lower Broadway sometime in the evening, and I became so overwhelmed. The drunkenness, it felt like being on Bourbon Street. And I guess I wasn't ready for that. And then all of a sudden it just became this big thing of like, these are what the honky tonks are. They're just spilling out into the road. People are barfing, getting into fist fights. That's not too far away from, you know, where it started. But it's like people are going on vacation to take a moment in these weird commercialized versions of honky tonks, as opposed to letting out their sorrows and their grief and their worries. I've had to unwind and think about what honky tonks were, as opposed to like what they've become, or what they, when you say that word, what people would picture now. How many cities in America, small or large, can you point to, unless you're in Texas or somewhere in the South, where you go, oh, we have a honky tonk here? What does that conjure up?
I think the biggest difference is people are going and barfing and getting fights because they're on spring break and not because they've been working out on an oil
Exactly.
dig.
Yeah. They're not on a cattle drive.
Yeah.
That's exactly right.
I think another thing that gets it confused is it started as a music type of space or a type of bar in rural areas. I was thinking the other day about what other types of clubs have become genres. Barrel House, which is one of the precursors, became a piano style. And then disco as well was discotheques. But not too many genres of music start as a type of venue, and then the connotation is the kind of music that was played in that venue.
The space defined the sound.
Honky tonks are really a byproduct of earlier American spaces, not only barrel houses, but saloons, juke joints, dance halls, music halls, and all these places were where people gathered for kind of rough communion, alcohol, dancing, infidelity. It's these kind of geological layers of nightlife, you know?
It's kind of like on the other side of for honky tonks to end up, becoming these like neon cathedrals, quote unquote. They're on the opposite end of the spectrum for Saturday night, burning down the honky tonk, the barrel house, the juke joint, and Sunday morning, showing up to church, working out the vice and the sin, and then looking for that redemption. And having those polarities for people is it's important. So to create these, the juke joint and the honky tonks and the barrel houses, and it's like the dance halls, you have to let it out. I mean, what a life. You have to let it out.
It all starts with drink. Whether we want to admit that or not, because, saloons, music getting integrated in what you kind of think of Western frontier saloons took a second. And then it got to the point where honky tonks were really one of the first venue types where there was like a full band. Because even a lot of juke joints would just have a single blues performer playing guitar or piano or like boogie piano. One really interesting piece of this, and it's, you see it with recent history coming out on a mainstream level concerning the banjo having West African origins and seeing the connections and the roots of country music with the African diaspora, that really the juke joint and the barrel house were precursors to the honky tonk. It might be an oversimplification to say that honky tonks were the white version of a juke joint, but it's not entirely wrong because they were serving the same desires, relief.
That's right.
The motives were all the same. It was just back then, it's just people didn't mix like we know so well.
Yeah. And, and I think it was, you're looking at like, especially post-Civil War, having these honky tonks and these barrel houses popping up, and then you have the juke joints. And I think it's all about like the creation of these spaces, especially safe spaces. These are dens of vice, and these are, sometimes brothels, and sometimes this is where illegal activity was happening, quote unquote illegal activity, but they're safe spaces for the working class to blow off steam in a way that's extremely necessary. And I think the music industry, the live music industry, is fueled by the sale of alcohol. We're sitting in the Orion Amphitheater right now. This place exists on the bar sales from the concerts. It has been and it will always be tied. Like that's how you're kind of cutting loose.
I'm going to qualify one of your statements in there. So safe space to do dangerous things.
Yeah. Well, and so let's put that in another context. When we were coming up and cutting our teeth and needing to find spaces that we wanted to express ourselves musically and even our angst, I would look for like the dingy punk clubs or the places that I'm like, this seems like a dangerous space. This seems like a safe space to do dangerous things. There's a circle.
Nobody's
and
watching.
It looks like kids are kicking the shit out of each other, but they're blowing off steam and my parents aren't watching. The man isn't watching. This underground network has taken protective measures. I go back to, I don't know how much we've talked about it, but I worked at Simon's, that underground rave club in Gainesville. Straight up, the owner was paying off the cops to not come in the doors, because it was, for that crowd, a safe space to do dangerous things. I think we need to rename our podcast.
A safe space to do dangerous things. Yes. So the gist of what we're saying right now is that honky tonks didn't emerge from a vacuum. They were two a decent degree the white working class version of something that already existed within the Black Southern culture. And they came with their own regional twist depending on where you were. They started cropping up in Texas and Oklahoma as people were spreading further out west. New Mexico, Arkansas, obviously in the 20s and 30s. And it was kind of right as the oil towns and all those new highways were transformed the rural economy. I mean, I think that's a major point, is that this is very much a working class place for people to let go. It's not high society or tourism at this point. It's really mobile labor, guys drilling in wells, working refineries, hauling freight. Often where these honky tonks were towns that sprung up really fast. A lot of times you wouldn't always have bands or local musicians or people coming through. And when the jukebox came around, that was a real revelation, because all of a sudden you could dance and hear your favorite honky tonk song on a jukebox. And it's also the period that it was coming around, because really when you think about the modern canonized idea of a honky tonk, you're really talking about the 1940s. Ernest Tubb had in 1941 Walking the Floor Over You, which is often credited as the first honky tonk song. Now, you may not be able to see Ernest Tubb at your juke joint in the middle of nowhere in Texas, but you could hear it on the jukebox.
That's right.
That was a huge revelation technologically.
Yeah, absolutely. It's interesting how that evolves. The difference between these spaces being something where artists are performing, whether it be solo or a band, it all has to do with the crowd engagement. So you have dance halls and you have honky tonks that are a lot more centered around the spectacle of the band and dancing and brawling, as opposed to, like, I think you start evolving into also with the jukebox. Of course, there's dancing and there's, raucous behavior, but there's also the ability to sit at the bar and cry into your beer, depending on how you're curating the night. And all of a sudden, it democratizes it. And the people who are at the venue, who are sitting at the bar, it's up to them how the night goes. It's not up to the band leader.
One very prescient thing that I've heard a lot of old schoolers say is it wasn't necessarily a place to work out your problems. It was a place just to let the air dry a little bit. Move from point A to point B. You weren't going to solve anything at a honky tonk. In fact, you may create some more issues, but it lets you blow off enough steam to get to the next day.
Again, I think we go back to all these spaces being important to all the people that find them and need them. You're not working out any problems. These aren't spaces that you're finding solutions. And yeah, you're probably creating more problems. But the bigger point being, you go to these spaces to either discover or remind yourself that you're not alone. Whether you're hearing Hank Williams lyrics, or Lefty Frizzell, and it hits you and like, oh, shit, I'm not alone. That's huge, right? Someone else's
living
stuff.
Hard like me.
Yeah. And so it's like a collective, it's a space of collective suffering. It's a safe space for dangerous things and collective suffering.
Speaking of creating more problems, there's so many, especially early on, the idea of brawls or so. Honky tonks almost thought of as the music venue version of hockey games.
Right. What do you think about like Roadhouse?
Right.
Yeah.
I wanted to talk about not only that, but some of the intrinsic elements of what we identify even to this day that got canonized of what makes a honky tonk. Jukeboxes. Some people would say sawdust on the floor at times. Some people...
There's always a lot of wood.
Neon, wood.
Yeah.
Buckets for leaks. Of course, a lot of salty local characters. Kind of have to go through that initiation period of proving yourself if you're out of towner, obviously, and probably rightfully so. It depends on the space too, because those smaller spaces where it all started out were very closed off. If you knew everybody there, you were good. If you didn't know people there, it was going to take you a moment. Some of these places that we think about now as honky tonks that carry the name of music hall or ballroom, mainly because there's been a little revisionism of what we think of the sound being honky tonks, like Kane's Ballroom. It's one of the early honky tonks.
Yeah.
So large space. And by all classic definitions, you would think of it more as a dance hall. It is also a honky tonk. It's where all those lines of venue archetypes get blurred a little bit.
It's cool. And it's funny in our discussion with our conversation with Tracy Thomas, she talks about how Canes will reach out to see if Jason needs another shirt. But I was thinking about that, and I'm like, how cool is it that here is this establishment? And it's hard to evolve, like in the way you describe, just even perception-wise, but it's somewhere where Hank Williams played. And then and then Jason plays there, or the Avett Brothers, or what have you.
And it started in the 20s as a garage, and then became a dance academy in the 30s, and then was really the ultimate stomping ground for Bob Wills and Texas swing, very much tied into the identity of Tulsa.
Looking into the honky tonk history too, I had to just take a step, like I said, and I go, honky tonks, well, is that a Nashville thing? Honky tonks, well, wait. I'm now letting my brain kind of open up and think about, well, it's more like a Texas dance hall. And then I'm like, well, where is this kind of coming from? And then seeing the history of the cattle drives, a lot of the cowboys, like in the cattle drives, early part of the century, late 1800s and early part of the last century. And it's like, oh, that's Texas to Oklahoma. Equating honky tonk with Oklahoma didn't occur to me until we started looking into this a little more. But just, thinking about, oh yeah, Canes is in Tulsa. Wild history across the board, right? So it's like, forget, like, wow, that corridor from Texas to Oklahoma, and then how it kind of spilled out. Hank Williams being from Alabama. It's just an interesting thing to see it kind of spill out like that. But Oklahoma being a thing that I feel like we've scratched the surface of kind of seeing a little bit more of how that history kind of spilled out.
And ballrooms was kind of a almost tongue-in-cheek word for what these places were. They were really dance halls. The reason why a lot of those places got into kind of the lexicon of what we think about as honky tonks is because they were bigger, more famous. If you really try to dig around in the 30s and find a lot of specific names of early honky tonk type of establishments, it's very hard to find because they were temporary. They didn't last long. They would move on with the workers often. It's really those bigger rooms that kind of were starting to get in people's minds that they were getting in newspapers. The term honky tonk actually came about as a rough-hewn type of rough and tumble establishment used in papers in Texas in the 1880s, 1890s.
Yeah, I remember it was like 1880 something where they found the first reference of a honky tonk, but it was definitely paired with the same words that circle around brothel, barroom, brothel, like, den of sin and vice. And then trying to tie that, I saw that like the piano, and it's the Tonk brothers, late 1800s, like piano manufacturers. And they're like, there's debate on where honky tonk actually originated, the word, and tying that Tonk brothers piano piece, because that barroom piano being a big part of it in the beginning as well.
The barrel house in boogie music, because
That's
it's
right.
that left-handed shuffle rhythm that really defines the way a honky-tonk sound. As we're tying this into migration, one real interesting thing that I never pieced together before we really dove in on this was Bakersfield. And I just never was kind of aware that a lot of Bakersfield were Okie refugees that had been in the Dust Bowl and had dealt with the black blizzards and that whole like environmental disaster in the 30s. And the reason why those communities and that country way of life was because that's where a lot of people from Oklahoma ended up.
It's so interesting to see like how some of that cattle drive from Texas to Oklahoma and, the kind of residual cultural things that come outside of that. How does this genuinely get birthed and or carried over to places like Southern California and, areas, especially at the time? And I say that knowing that like right now you could go to Tokyo and go find a honky tonk, so it's like
Bushwick.
There's a new honky tonk in Bushwick where people are line dancing. But is that idea of the time at the time? That's a cool note about Bakersfield, because the Bakersfield sound and what came on the heels of that was pretty important for music.
In the 1940s is really when you start getting more of these permanent or long-lasting honky-tonks. And, they weren't just migratory oddities. They were kind of these full-blown cultural presences. And a lot of that had to do with World War II. A lot of GIs coming back from the war had seen all sorts of hells and needed a place to drink, needed a place to
Not be alone.
commune together and not be alone. Exactly. And they didn't want fancy bartenders. They didn't want swank upscale. They wanted to just throw back and let whatever the hell happen.
Yeah, I think that safe space for dangerous things, and realizing like a lot of these spaces end up being these places where broken, where people who see themselves as broken can kind of congregate. And then in these spaces, you can be alone with a lot of people, or you can be with a lot of people.
Yeah. Yeah. And, the honky tonks really answered that need for that, especially those that were right on the edge of town. You knew to go into because they had a lit up neon sign in the window and you could possibly spot them from the road. And even if you didn't know the name, you just knew what kind of place it was.
You could smell it from down the street.
Smell the beer swill. You hear the jukebox coming as you walk up, and that was your place. And if it wasn't your place yet, it could possibly be. By the end of the 40s, what's wild is how consistent a blueprint everything became. By 1949, you could almost draw a honky tonk in your sleep. It had such an identity. A neon beer sign, a jukebox, as we've said, a band squeezed on a tiny plywood stage in the corner, cigarette machine, old school cigarette machine, a little tiny dance floor, and a bunch of people singing about loss and lack of sleep and hard times. No matter where you were, Texas, California, Oklahoma, you knew the vibe. Honky tonk, it wasn't a genre, but it was becoming a genre very much at that point.
Yeah.
And it was a smell, as you said.
It's a sound, a
And a
space, a
code.
smell.
And a code almost.
Yeah, that's right.
Being that we are here in Alabama, the 1950s brings on probably the most famous country musician of all time and the king of honky tonk and probably the poet laureate of country music easily.
Hillbilly Shakespeare.
Hillbilly Shakespeare, exactly.
Yeah.
Hank Williams.
Yeah.
He was born south of Montgomery and playing in a lot of small juke joints around Montgomery. He'd also do the Louisiana Hayride. A lot of these people would do, say, the Grand Ole Opry or Louisiana Hayride or these radio shows or these live variety shows, and then go sneak around and play a tiny little place late at night until 5 a.m.
Because I think that's more authentic to like where they came from and what they were doing. With Hank in particular, the Opry refused him for so long because of his drinking and just not being reliable. So I think he was still depending on that network. And I think that's where he felt most comfortable, right? Eventually, the Opry couldn't refuse him anymore because he was a megastar and people wanted to hear him. And then they started refusing him again. And he's back at the Louisiana Hayride. And then to go back to some of the stuff, it's the influence, especially from, the Black community and cultural piece. Hank Williams learned how to play guitar by shining shoes and getting money and paying an older Black gentleman to teach him how to play guitar. His son, Hank Williams Jr., was like, my dad was a blues singer, straight up. I'm so fascinated with Hank. We talk about the torture, not solving any problems in these spaces, just creating more problems. I mean, this guy was the voice of that.
Sometimes life is about passing time, it's getting to the next day. And I think the reason why that is these were proving grounds. It's, even when you're a big band and can play in a arena, if you can't still do it in a small club, I think that's why you would see Prince and the Rolling Stones and some of these acts still try to occasionally be like, do we have it to really be in front of 100 people with their arms crossed and make them start getting into it?
Yeah.
The 50s is kind of the decade where honky tonk becomes an emotional language. And, you've got to really think of the 4 big names in this. Obviously, Hank Williams, as we talked about, Lefty Frizzell, and of course, Kitty Wells, who wrote It Wasn't God Who Made Honky Tonk Angels.
Such a good song.
Which is flipping the whole script on the male-dominated world of honky tonks. And Webb Pierce, who was raking in tons of money on the jukebox.
Yeah.
Those were definitely the 4 big ones. And as radio was progressing as well, you have a lot of people hearing this music for the first time. And if you're young and can get a guitar, a lot of people started copying these performers, being influenced, like almost in the modern way we think of being influenced by music you hear. You think before 1925 and electric recordings, there wasn't really much of this music at all recorded, and it was not cheap. So anything you heard was either on the radio or you heard somebody play it on the street.
So the cross-pollination of these styles and this influence so much slower. And then it hits, and that advent of radio and someone across the country, across the states, or then understanding how this honky tonk as a space and as a music. Because if someone's hearing Hank Williams and they're influenced and they're like picking up the guitar, and there's so many stories of so many of the greats that it's like their number one influence was Hank Williams, made them pick up a guitar, or even a Lefty Frizzell. Where were they geographically, and how did that impact? And then does that music then create that culture that then creates the need for a honky tonk, or was there a version of a honky tonk in that little enclave to begin with?
It's interesting to me, to one point that we really need to focus on as well, that's so important, of what defines honky tonk as a sound that was an offshoot of the type of space it was in. People weren't going to not stop talking while you were playing. People weren't going to not stop clanking beers. People weren't going to stop fighting. So when amplification came about in the late 30s and electric guitars in the 40s, pedal stills, lap still, electric guitars, all that got cranked up. Drum sets kind of came in vogue because you had to be loud. And that was really what really transformed the Bakersfield sound that we talked about earlier.
Yeah.
I heard Buck Owens, a quote from him, and he's like, I wanted to be on top of the beat. I wanted to be loud. I wanted to be trebly. I wanted to really demand attention with what we were playing.
Even if I was to think of like a honky tonk sound, if I was to conjure up like a honky tonk sound, there's like the music, but then there's also the sound of glasses clinking, hooting and hollering, and loud conversation. So it's part of how I think about how a honky tonk sound is. That's always in the background.
Well, you hear so many modern songs that kind of have the Ice Cube or the drinks clanking, at the beginning of it or whatever, the sound effect. But that sound was it was loud. It was sharp.
It was piercing. Yeah.
Definitely unfiltered. With Bakersfield, really the club that established so much there was the Blackboard. That's where Buck Owens and the Buckaroos, so many people used that as their platform to get loud, get wild, get faster, and then have it expand from there. But I'm sure it was really wild for, what had become the very countrypolitan sound of Nashville to be like, what the hell are these yahoos out in Bakersfield? What kind of music is this?
It felt like a reaction to and almost an affront to as like Nashville getting that country music, or how they're calling it, like flipping it from hillbilly music to country western, or however they wanted to kind of package it. You have these Bakersfield musicians, and like all of a sudden the loud, fast rowdiness of it. It feels like an affront. And again, being like, how the hell is this coming from California?
Because Nashville at the time were adding strings to the sound, really
Orchestra,
kind of Pat Boone-ifying.
That's right. Yeah.
And smoothing everything out for radio. And granted, there's some huge hits because of that kind of generalizing of the sound, but that's something that Bakersfield's folks were not interested in.
It's kind of interesting to watch that era of Nashville, especially the Nashville recording, and how it's like, let's kind of package and make things a little safe and kind of polish everyone up. You see pictures of whether it be Merle, Willie, George Jones, some of these artists that when they eventually kind of broke out of that costume and owned like their more authentic voice or whatever, Willie's story's great, George too, but it's like, man, when they kind of broke out of that, what Nashville was pinning on them, it really changed everything. Like the Outlaws, but
Right.
it's I love the fact that like Bakersfield being such a big piece of how that all kind of came to be. It amazes me that was a reaction of.
Bakersfield is kind of what kept it alive. You think about it as the bridge between the 50s era, kind of the golden era of honky tonk, to that 70s hippie Willie Nelson outlaw country era of honky tonk. It's really kept the fire burning in a lot of ways.
Oh, completely. And then you have everything going into like Flying Burrito Brothers and Graham Parsons and, the Dwight Yoakam, what that carried over. It looked really cool, which I think goes back to some of the early honky tonk stuff too, with the outfits and these rhinestone cowboys. Man, it had great costumes. It looked a certain way, but man, there was some rough things underneath and coming out of there.
It wasn't cosplay. It wasn't nostalgia at that point. It was homage, especially what the Cosmic Country guys,
that's right,
like International Submarine Band, Graham Parsons, all, were doing. I think one important club, vastly important club during that era, which was a satellite to the Bakersfield sound, where a lot of people played in North Hollywood, of all places, was the Palomino Club. And it was sort of, the West Coast version of the Esquire Ballroom in Houston or somewhere. It was a very important club. And Graham Parsons did play there. Cosmic Country never got fully accepted or integrated into the traditional Okie from Muskogee world. But it's interesting to think it was a place where you could have the Flying Burrito Brothers and Merle Haggard playing on different nights of the week.
That's an incredible piece of it. That keeping it alive and watching it evolve for better or worse. And you're right, the Cosmic Country, I'm a huge Graham fan. He's got an interesting story, like rich kid from Florida. What he was doing at the time, I'm sure it did seem like hippies doing country cosplay. But in reality, from everything I've gathered, it was an authentic reaction and an homage. It evolved, and it evolved so quickly thanks to places like this. We're talking about these like slivers of time over these decades. Again, going back to that advent of radio and people being influenced, and all of a sudden the way this honky tonk and hillbilly music started to evolve is so interesting. And it went from like, you don't just go to this honky tonk to hear country music. You can go to the Palomino and you can hear a little bit of rock and country. And it starts getting a lot more spread out in a really interesting way.
And I feel like in our present era, like Sturgill and Charlie Crockett and some of these guys, you can really sniff out the difference between affectation and someone that has a genuine love for a culture and a music. And I feel they have a connection, even though the music's slightly different, to Graham Parsons in that way, where a young guy fascinated by this tradition.
That's right.
I think that's a real pure place to come from musically.
I do think about it with those artists. Sturgill is someone interesting who starts off a little more feeling like traditional, and then watching his like cosmic journey. And then you have someone like a Charlie Crockett. I love turning on a Charlie Crockett record because it's like, you can go, what year is this? You know what I mean? And and I think he does it in a very authentic way. I think the reason why he's popular, getting even more popular, it's because of how he does that. I love artists like Margo Price and, other artists, and Sarah Farrell, and these ones who are doing, it is an homage. There's an authentic honoring of a sound and a space and time. And they're bringing it to now, but with their own twist. And I think that will always be something that I think we should applaud across all genres. Early 90s in Florida, punk, hardcore scene or whatever, right? I was trying to be a little more broad about what I was listening to. So I was listening to a ton of music. I really loved discovering Uncle Tupelo, Whiskey Town, some of the alternative country stuff. And I was always trying to like wrap my head around, how do I like evolve as a person, or like someone who appreciates this music, into like, I can't just listening to this one genre. And I really love this. And, as I kind of grew in that, there was a few people I noticed that were like in the scene or whatever that were also listening to alternative country and trying to connect those threads. And there was this guy, Brian. He was in a couple huge like Miami, South Florida hardcore bands. Brian had the sideburns, the neck choker, the baggy pants, playing guitar in all these hardcore bands. I think I didn't see him for a month. And then I saw him one day. He was at a show or something. He had a white brimmed like a cowboy hat and tight jeans and this like pearl button country shirt on. He looked like how Charlie Crockett dresses almost. And I remember being like, whoa, what the hell? And he had flipped everything in his identity from like this punk hardcore kid into this, like, what are you doing? Like, what is this? But he was, and still is, because he is actually like performing with this, but he started putting out country music and just completely flipped what he was doing and was so influenced by it. And it was the first example I saw of someone just like taking this, being way more influenced and inspired by a certain sound and a certain scene. And he reached back to a lot of this honky tonk we're talking about. He was the first person I remember talking a lot about the history of artists. I was just wrapping my head around Uncle Tupelo at the time, So anyways, it just, to see how that happens is so fascinating to me. And when people do it authentically, it's really cool to see.
People with our background come from punk rock, indie, alternative sort of world. Maybe we can be a little too quick to be judgmental. In the early 90s, for example, there were always those bands, especially when I got to college, that, oh, your band sounded like REM a month ago, and now you sound like the Red Hot Chili Peppers. And you kind of castigate them for that. But when you really look at it, especially early country music, especially if you're digging into Jimmy Rogers, that tradition comes from vaudeville, dressing up like a brakeman in a train playing live was very much a vaudeville thing. There's always been that. I think that's part of flair and affectation to becoming an exaggerated version of what the archetype is, how rich that is, and how it's a hokey show, but it's grandly done in the Beverly Hillbillies.
Yeah.
And my good friends who I've known forever and played so many shows with over the years, that a lot of people, I think, don't appreciate how deep and rich their history is with that connection to vaudeville and that kind of yucking it up in a very smart way. It's Southern culture on the skid.
I was about to say, it's a great example. It
all starts from that exaggerated version of what an archetype is from vaudeville. So I think sometimes we're quick to judge of, that person's a poser. That's not what they're really from. It's hard to really know how much somebody loves something, or if they're cashing in on it, and maybe if the music's good, maybe we shouldn't even dig into that. Maybe we'd have a cleaner soul.
Well, I'll say, I think maybe we were judgmental, but I don't run across many people who are as much anymore. Like, I think the exponential influence of accessibility to music culture, and I think it's that, like, I feel great about the generations that are more and more just open and accepting and influenced by, you have a band like, they're always kind of mentioned in this way, but like a band like Turnstile, a band that's like flipping genres or whatever. I love the fact that that's more of a thing now than ever, where it's like a large band can like be putting out artists can put out different genres of records, and it feels authentic. It doesn't feel like cashing in, like, oh, here we go, Lana Del Rey's going to do a country record because everyone loves country. It's like Lana Del Rey's, like, I think, following her own mission and dream and influence and channeling something that, like, is real. Like, I love that. And I think the people that want to poke holes in that don't really understand it. But to your point, there's the ones who are real. You can see that as clear as day. Because I love Graham and because I love so much of this history, it's like, I would love to just get a nudie suit and wear it around, and not just
wear it around here at the amphitheater.
I would love to, but I think people are like, here comes Colonel Sanders or something.
Pretty quick it's going to be like, oh, it's that dude.
It's that dude who wears the stupid nudie suit.
He really needs some attention. Where we're kind of leaving off before we went on the artistic authenticity diversion was, you have a lot of expansion of these clubs existing, especially in Texas and California, the Panther Hall in Houston, Esquire Ballroom, Broken Spoke in Austin. We talked about the Palomino and the Blackboard in California, and that really gave way to this cultural divide that was coming about in the 1970s with outlaw country coming out of the Vietnam War, and a lot of the more political, clear-eyed version of maybe how sordid the world was and how overly strict and repressed and authoritarian the world was at that point.
Think about how some of these, like, especially in Texas, and like how some of this, like, how Willie Nelson and Waylon and like these things that are like starting to come. I think about our conversation about San Francisco around the same time too, you know, and it is that post-Vietnam War disillusionment and how that hits and clashes and incorporates itself culturally into this. And all of a sudden you have the guy that just returned home from war sitting next to the, you know, long-haired hippie at the Honky Tonk in Texas. What a blend this starts becoming again.
The most visible sign is how long the hair got.
That's right.
You know,
yeah.
and it's really when there's not only longer hair, more facial hair, leather vest, and Nashville continued to smooth it out, add more horn sections, and you had this whole group of outlaw country that were like, no, we're gonna take it back to the barroom, and we're gonna take it back to maybe a new kind of purity, but still in the roots of what this should be.
And we're not alone in this. I always love, as much as I love Hank Williams' story and how that thread goes, I love Willie Nelson's story as well. And his journey from Texas, bright-eyed, bushy-tailed, you know, going into then, you know, Nashville, having his ass whooped, trying to, you know, that crew cut crooner version of Willie, finding himself in the middle of Broadway, just wanting to die, and then going back to Texas. And it's like, what a rebirth. That's the crosshairs of what we're talking about here. And like that reclaiming of what got him to pick up a guitar in the first place.
Getting back to Austin, having that fusion of the hippie countercultural world with that honky tonk ethos. And, you know, the place where that all gelled for him was the Armadillo World Headquarters. That was really where everything kind of came to a point of clarity for him, at least. The Armadillo wasn't a traditional honky tonk. It was much bigger. It was much messier. It was a music commune of sorts. But what happened there was pure honky tonk energy. And there was a legendary show in 1972 where Willie played Whiskey River and everybody just went insane. You know, it was like that is a cultural zeitgeist moment. You know, you've got long hairs and rednecks two-stepping together, passing joints and beers.
Yeah.
It's a very like coalescing of forces there. And from there, it just keeps on spreading with outlaw country. It's acceptable to be rough again. And who comes in but Waylon Jennings wanting to take that throne on and take it on well.
I keep on saying how many artists in this genre I love. Waylon is just uncompromisingly awesome. You know, that how he took on what an energy, what a honky tonk and punk energy, outlaw energy, however you want to put it. But how cool is that? But I also want to note the passing of joints and beers. It's an interesting thing culturally when, like, let's say the marijuana influence. It can't be denied as far as like how it starts kind of spreading out a sound and a vibe. I don't know if that's the word I want to use, but the idea that like, yeah, your hair gets a little longer. You are passing a joint and all of a sudden the crowd's mixing. There's a little more, for lack of a better word, there's a peace within the chaos. You know?
It's an aftermath of the countercultural with that red dirt marijuana.
Right. Yeah.
Heard something very astute. It was mostly talking about Waylon, but you could say it for a lot of those outlaw country guys is they had things that they wouldn't say to you, but they could sing about it.
Oh, I like that.
Yeah, it's kind of, you think psychologically is, you know, I would never have a candid conversation and pour my heart out to somebody, but I'll sing about it for a room full of people.
Well, it's funny. You go back to talking about some of the, even in the birth of like some of the honky tonk stuff, and you think about this with blues and, you know, some of what's happening in the birth of this, especially in a masculine, male dominated way, you have these psychologically tortured men. They can't speak about certain things, but they can sing about it. And you can hear it and you can nod and cry into your beer and go, yep. But you're not going to really share about it. But that's that, again, collective, like, we're not alone in this. But the next layer is that idea that, like, yeah. But on the other side of it, I think Waylon and Willie and Chris Christopherson and some of these artists that they start getting pretty outspoken too. You know?
Chris Christopherson was a genius, you know, Cambridge, the least likely person you would think would be in the outlaw scene, but what a brilliant poetic spokesperson for the world.
And I think a really tortured in some ways, but also brilliant. Like Chris Christopherson.
He's a helicopter pilot too, right?
Yeah. Too smart for his own good.
You know, Waylon then was playing in the Panther Hall in Fort Worth and Gillies and Pasadena. Pasadena being right outside of Houston, Texas. Places that were just absolutely made for that sound. The rooms were right there with him, just rowdy and loaded and nodding along. But, with Gillies, this is when we start to really get a sea change. It was a monster. It was opened in 71 with a capacity of 6,000. I think the live venue space was a few thousand, or at least you could shove them in there. It was part dance hall, part theme park, part Honky Tonk Coliseum. And somehow, even with all the mechanical bulls and the neon carnival fill, Gillies kept that honky tonk core. And the music was still very much bar ready and still built to move the room. And not quite when we start seeing line dancing come about, but you start seeing these very large gatherings of people kind of start to get a cultural push to give us honky tonk night fever, which we'll talk about in a second. I think the movie we're talking about.
Yeah.
Starring the same actor.
Yeah.
Is that scene with Billy Joe Schaefer, Merle Haggard, and a lot of those guys played together, wrote songs for each other over the years. And
what a scene.
So many clubs of this era in Texas just still had the Broken Spoke, had the Silver Dollar in Waco. These are rooms that felt like family if family, well, most family has a lot of whiskey and unresolved issues anyway. So definitely was the vibe. So with the outlaw ecosystem and Waylon and the Nashville Machine and Billy Joe writing the hymns, it's all starting to be on the cusp of something new. So the 1970s didn't just revive honky tonk. It reminded everyone why it mattered and why the neon light still draws people in. Sometimes you don't want therapy, you just want a song that bleeds the way you do. Coming up, we're going to talk about the urban and the cowboy together and how that came about. We'd like to thank everyone so much for listening to part 1 of our History of the Honky Tonk Archetype. Some of the material that we used to research this episode were books like The Broken Spoke, Austin's Legendary Honky Tonk, 20th Century Honky Tonk, The Amazing Unauthorized Story of Kane's Ballroom, First 75 Years, and Reading Country Music, Steel Guitars, Opry Stars, and Honky Tonk Bars. Stay tuned for part 2 as we examine the modernization and corporatization of the honky tonk.